Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this is a reading of The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This will be part 6 of chapter 2, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Antichrist. Again, this is part 6, Conclusion. Interestingly, Nietzsche suggests that the honest pursuit of truth is frequently at odds with the pursuit of happiness, and that in turn the tension between these two pursuits underlies the prevalence of faith and other examples of deception that he associates with religion, and with idealism in general. In this vein, he writes the following in a letter to his sister Elizabeth in 1865. Quote, "Every true faith is indeed infallible. It performs what the believing person hopes to find in it. But it does not offer the least support for the establishing of an objective truth. Here the ways of men divide. If you want to achieve peace of mind and happiness, then have faith. If you want to be a disciple of truth, then search." End quote. Footnote 459 cites the source. James echoes Nietzsche's sentiments about the power and allure of happiness when it comes to considerations of truth, writing that, quote, "With such relations between religion and happiness, it is perhaps not surprising that men come to regard the happiness which a religious belief affords as a proof of its truth. If a creed makes a man feel happy, he almost inevitably adopts it." End quote. Footnote 460 cites the source. Ultimately, Nietzsche makes it clear that he thinks the pursuit of truth is not an easy or pleasurable path, and, as we have seen, he thinks it is a path seldom traveled as a result. Hence, quote, "It requires greatness of soul. The service of truth is the hardest service." End quote. Footnote 461 cites the source. In fact, in Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes, quote, "It might be a basic characteristic of existence that those who would know it completely would perish, in which case the strength of a spirit should be measured according to how much of the truth one could still barely endure, or to put it more clearly, to what degree one would require it to be thinned down, shrouded, sweetened, blunted, falsified." End quote. Footnote 462 cites the source. Presumably writing for those who are capable of traversing the more difficult path, Nietzsche asserts in the preface to the Antichrist that, quote, "This book belongs to the very few." End quote. Footnote 463 cites the source. And he warns his readers that, quote, "When it comes to spiritual matters, you need to be honest to the point of hardness, just to be able to tolerate my seriousness, my passion." End quote. Footnote 464 cites the source. Finally, the juxtaposition of religion with science also reflects the divergent paths of happiness and truth. On the one hand, in the case of religion, the emphasis is thought to be on happiness and comfort, while on the other hand, in the case of science, truth is thought to be the highest priority. Since Nietzsche suggests that a sincere concern for truth can come at the expense of happiness, the deception he associates with slaves should not come as much of a surprise. Nietzsche himself identifies the psychological impetus for such dishonesty. Since they cannot accept life on earth as it really is, they must cope by inventing lies and falsehoods that allay the discomfort associated with this reality. That is, without these deceptions, their lives would be filled with misery and dread. Oddly enough, then, the slave's self-deception turns out to be a kind of necessity, in which case it would also seem natural. After all, on Nietzsche's own account, the slave cannot survive without such deceptions. They are, quote, "life-preserving airs," end quote, and, quote, "a means for preservation," end quote. And he acknowledges that there is a reason human beings adopt such convictions, suggesting that, quote, "It is the profound suspicious fear of an incurable pessimism that forces whole millennia to bury their teeth in and cling to a religious interpretation of existence," end quote. Footnote 465 cites the source. Hence, engaging in idealism is by no means a superfluous endeavor, but is instead seemingly necessary for their health. Some human beings need religion and idealism in order to avoid despair, and thus survive. As a result, I cannot help but question the practicality of Nietzsche's cure. While Nietzsche claims that, quote, "We ourselves, we free spirits, already constitute a revaluation of all values, a living declaration of war on and victory over all old concepts of true and untrue," end quote. Footnote 466 cites the source. I'm skeptical that Nietzsche's Overman is practically feasible for the vast majority of human beings. As I suggested a moment ago, becoming an Overman seems to require us to become what requires us to overcome what it means to be human in the first place, to cease asking why, and to ignore our existential anxieties. A psychologist like Nietzsche ought to acknowledge and respect, first and foremost, what it means to actually be human, and thus recognize, among other things, the very trait that distinguishes human beings from all other modes of existence: spirit, or self-reflective being, self-consciousness. What's more, the health a psychologist is concerned with entails the health of the spirit, or self-reflective nature, i.e., mental health. For better or worse, it is our nature not to be content with simply existing, given our consciousness of our existence. Hence, given the self-conscious existence human beings inherit, asking why seems inevitable. So too, indulging in idealism in order to satiate this existential reflection seems like a natural response, since existential anxieties can otherwise yield despair. The upshot is that being human is dangerous and extremely uncomfortable, and as a result, a human being, quote, needs a vision, a goal, a sense of direction, end quote. Footnote 467 cites the source. In my estimation, Nietzsche failed to grasp the extent to which the need to ask why and to satiate the existential anxiety associated with our self-reflective nature are defining characteristics of what it means to be human. Hence, they cannot be so easily ignored. Unfortunately, Nietzsche conceptualizes health under the assumption that such necessary byproducts of our self-reflective nature can be ignored. In fact, for Nietzsche, it seems that good health comes to mean precisely this: overcoming a human being's natural inclination to question existence, and to then subsequently indulge in idealism. However, since this does not seem very realistic, it looks as though Nietzsche's notion of health is misleading and problematic. Furthermore, mental health, or lack thereof, can have significant effects on physical well-being, as, for example, suicide and stress. And when it comes to human beings, mental health is vital for flourishing. Mental health is, in turn, directly related to one's sense of security and well-being with respect to the existential anxieties arising from self-consciousness. In my view, Nietzsche fails to appreciate and acknowledge the mental stability religions and other instances of idealism can help facilitate. While Nietzsche frequently suggests that idealism is negatively correlated with health, it would seem that idealism, if anything, positively impacts one's health. After all, the idealist is, in a sense, less troubled by the question why, or even ceases to ask it altogether, since he or she allows him or herself to indulge in answers. At the very least, one must wonder whether those like Nietzsche, who actively downplay the significance of human beings' existential reflections, are able to foster the kind of peace of mind that religions and other instances of idealism seem to offer. I argue that, by proposing his revaluation of all values, what Nietzsche actually does is jeopardize the mental stability of slaves because their existential reflections and anxieties are brought back into focus. They must face the chaos once more, only to ask the question why all over again, as this is what they are naturally inclined to do. Yet Nietzsche supposes this regression to be healthy because it minimizes the importance of alleviating and satisfying the existential needs that religions and other instances of idealism provide. In sum, I contend that Nietzsche's brand of thoroughgoing naturalism would prove unsatisfactory for the vast majority of people, namely those Nietzsche would label as slaves. For this reason, I must conclude that Nietzsche's prescription for a revaluation of all values, and for a submission to his brand of naturalism, is simply not a promising or realistic option for most people, regardless of whether Nietzsche is right to suggest that they are too weak for it. The fact remains that slaves, by definition, find the master mentality and the thoroughgoing naturalism upon which it rests unsatisfactory, and they simply will not or cannot settle for it. Moreover, when it comes to the issue of health, and perhaps even more importantly to Nietzsche's advice for how to go about adopting a healthy, life-affirming attitude, we should not forget to consider Nietzsche's own health. I've already alluded to Nietzsche's pervasive physical ailments in footnote 378, and there's good reason to believe that his mental health was suspect throughout much of his life as well. In addition to the 10-year period of insanity at the end of his life, Nietzsche documents bouts of melancholy and existential crises throughout his life. Consider, for example, the following samples. Quote, "There were dark moments, meanwhile, whole days and nights, when I did not know any longer how to go on living, and when a black despair attacked me, worse than I had ever known before." End quote. Footnote 468 cites the source. Quote, "I am a half-madman who suffers in the head and whom long solitude has confused completely." End quote. Footnote 469 cites the source. Quote, "I no longer see why I should live for another 6 months. Everything is boring, painful." End quote. Footnote 470 cites the source. Quote, "A few times I also thought of the opposite, driving my solitude and renunciation to its ultimate point and." End quote. Footnote 471 cites the source. Quote, "The barrel of a revolver is for me now a source of relatively pleasant thoughts." End quote. Footnote 472 cites the source. Quote, "I confess I am even more pleased about my non-readers, people who have never heard either my name or the word philosophy." End quote. Footnote 473 cites the source. While most would admit to having their own personal problems, and to having experienced great melancholy on occasion, Nietzsche was clearly unable to master the art of life affirmation, and he could hardly be considered a model for healthy living, or a person worth approaching for any kind of related advice. In fairness, perhaps he was merely trying to embody an ideal that he believed to be the best one, without ever thinking or maintaining that he had, in fact, fully realized it. In conclusion, I concur with many of Nietzsche's views regarding the illusory nature of various forms of idealism, including most notably many of those instantiated in religion. However, I question the sagacity of the prescriptive implications arising from his take on the relationship between religion, and idealism in general, and health, as well as his celebrated espousal of the revaluation of all values. Thus, I am ultimately inclined to agree with Kaufmann, who argues that, quote, Nietzsche attains greatness through his diagnoses rather than through his prescriptions, end quote. Footnote 474 cites the source. Despite what Nietzsche suggests, religion does not seem to be inherently counterproductive to the well-being of individuals. In the next chapter, I explore the thesis advanced by James that religion is, in fact, vitally useful to individuals insofar as it delivers a kind of existential satisfaction that is otherwise unattainable. So again, that was part 6 of chapter 2, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Antichrist, from The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. Thanks.